Right, okay, we're going to change the subject a bit. It's a topic that I do like talking about as a former head of business inflation and UK trade at the Office for National Statistics. I always follow the economy and what's going on in the US and the UK very closely. So I'm delighted that free market economic consultant and president of Knowledge and Decisions Economic Consulting, Michael Austin, is joining me with right now. Thank you for joining me, Michael. Now, we've heard a lot about Bidenomics. Biden describes them as growing the economy from the middle out and bottom up, not the top down. How would you describe Bidenomics?
Thanks so much for having me, James. I would describe Bidenomics as kind of like a magician's act. It's a lot of flashy distractions, but it really does lack substance. When you dig down deeper, it's really about doubling down on excessive spending, taxation, and regulation. And clearly, it's an economic form of a sleight of hand, but it's destined to backfire. I think it's time that we swap out that pragmatic, what his attempt is, if our pragmatic approach, and really focus on fiscal responsibility over budgetary illusions.
But I mean, my question, I guess the question I've got in the back of my head, though, is we keep on hearing, how inflation has hit people's quality of life, the amount of money that consumers have got in their pockets. But Bidenomics is all about, apparently, growing the economy from the bottom up. Is that actually what's happening? Are people in America feel that they've got more money in their pockets?
No, it's not about growing the economy from the bottom up. That's just what he tells the public in order for them to
Yeah.
look the other way. But what it really is about is growing government. And when you grow government, the only thing that can happen in an economy is that you have record inflation. And so, if you walk across the street in any town in America and you ask Americans how they feel today, let's say versus 4 years ago, 9 out of 10 Americans will tell you that they're feeling it at the pump. They're feeling it at checkout when they go to the grocery store. They're feeling it when they seems to buy every little thing. And it's clear that they don't have enough money to deal with the record prices. And going back to just the basics of economics, it's a tax on the working poor. And so when we really see what's happening to the working class here in America, it's clear that inflation is going up and not going down.
Yeah, I mean, inflation is one thing. In the UK here, I don't know whether you follow the UK market, but we've got the highest taxes in a generation, and we've obviously been coping with inflation like a lot of Western countries as well. What is the tax burden like in the US at the moment, if you look at it compared to historical figures?
Well, I would say that there was a lot of good work done back in 2017 under the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. That was done under President Trump, where it really worked to not only lower both personal income taxes, but also corporate income taxes. So thankfully, that rate structure is still with us now. However, among that Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, there were plenty of provisions that are now expiring because they only had a 10-year window. And so we're really at a crossroads now where we most certainly need Congress to find a way to work together and provide some relief to American families or businesses. Otherwise, by next year or the next 2 years, many families and businesses are going to see tax increases on top of this record rise in prices.
Yeah, okay. And touching on inflation, obviously we've seen an inflation peak at 9.1% back in 2022. I think the latest figures are 3.2% for February. Now, as far as I can read, and I do follow what goes on in the US, there's mixed messages coming out at the moment. We had Jerome Powell come out a couple of weeks ago. He's obviously the chief of the Federal Reserve. He came out and said, the US is close now to cutting rates, interest rates. However, already 2 weeks on, it's not totally clear. There seems to be mixed messages going on. What's your reading of the situation?
When it comes to the Federal Reserve, and very rarely do they ever act in terms of actual economic policy anymore. And really, they're driven largely by the politics of the situation. So when you think about the Federal Reserve going on right now and having interest rates high, first off, that's not primarily the problem. The problem is the fact that the balance sheet of the Federal Reserve is almost 900, I believe, trillion dollars. It is massive. They're taking so much more extra cash and assets, and it's of course leading to not only higher interest rates, but also record inflation. But at the same time, what it's also doing is that it's increasing the payments for the federal government on its interest on its debt. So it's not about whether the economy is really healing or not. It's whether the fiscal.
I think we've got Michael back. Hello, Michael.
Hey there, sorry about that. I'm back.
No, that's okay, no problem. Yeah, you were telling us about the problem that the Fed has got. You know, I was just trying to explain it. If they drop rates, yes, that will help US banks, which are struggling. It will help the government service the debt, but it also runs the risk of setting off inflation again, doesn't it?
It really does. And that's why, whenever the Fed creates a boom, it also inevitably creates a bust. I mean, this has been the problem going all the way back to 1913, which is when the Federal Reserve first got created in the U.S. government. And so the real focus is how do you make government smaller? It's not about whether you should push interest rates higher or push interest rates lower. It's whether government should be involved at all. And when it comes to the Federal Reserve, clearly its balance sheet is way too big, and it needs to release all those funds back into the economy to circulate.
Yeah, and of course, the backdrop to this, you'll know very well, Michael, is the problem that the dollar could be in over the next few years. We've got the BRICS countries all talking about the de-dollarization of the world economy. How big a factor do you think that is immediately this year?
Well, I think it all just depends on the confidence that the rest of the world has in the U.S. market. I believe, a couple of years ago, there was a lot of talk about the Chinese yuan somewhat taking place. But as the Chinese economy has clearly faltered in the last 2 years, people still feel secure in the U.S. market. But that can only last as the federal government has a budget that is sustainable. The higher that interest rate payments go, the higher the debt to GDP ratio. I'm not surprised if other countries have conversations about looking elsewhere to make sure that their currency is sound.
Yeah, and of course, it didn't help, did it, that the Biden administration confiscated all of those dollars off Russia? Because I think there's a lot of countries around the world now that are looking at their US reserves and they're thinking, well, hang on a second, if we do something that the US doesn't like, are they going to confiscate that? So I don't think the US has done itself any favors there. Michael, what do you think about Jamie Dimon? He's obviously the chief of JP Morgan Chase. He's been saying that, look, the economy seems in certain respects seems to be booming at the moment. We've got the stock market is still reaching all-time highs, driven by the big tech stocks. But he's talking about a risk of recession this year. Do you really think we could see a recession in the US in the year of an election?
Well, I think Jamie Dimon is speaking to something that's kind of fundamental here. You can't just look at the stock market and think the economy fundamentally is strong, right? You have to look at what we call mainstream America, middle America. How are everyday families, how are, small businesses doing and trying to get by? And clearly, we're in a situation that ever since COVID and massive government spending, that the burden is getting far and far higher. And then when you tack on inflation, and yes, inflation may be subsiding, but that still means that prices are rising. You still find it harder and harder for families to see ends meet. So whether we can see a recession, I think that's always possible. There's always that time constraint, but you also have to look at, whether the federal government is really getting out of the way or whether it's causing even more harm to businesses who are just trying to earn a buck and serve the American public.
Yeah. And obviously, we've got that election this year. What are you hearing from Trump in terms of what he's going to do to sort out the economy?
What we're hearing, at least from President Trump, sounds promising, right? It's finding a way to beat inflation, finding a way to grow our energy production back again. It's finding a way to secure our border. I mean, you've heard it in the news here in America and maybe even across the world, where our southern border is a complete mess, where we have, massive illegal immigrant crisis, and the Joe Biden administration doesn't want to do anything to stop it. And that has so many unintended consequences and repercussions. So at least from what we're hearing about securing our southern border, that is a step in the right direction. And then, of course, we have to get American energy growing again and then let these businesses do what they do best, and that's make a profit so that we can finally see some higher wages and prices coming down.
Yeah, and what is going on with all of these democratic states at the moment? They've taken in thousands and thousands, well, millions actually over the if you look over the past few years of all of these illegals coming across the border. I'm now hearing stories where basically, the states have run out of money, democratic states, to house and feed these immigrants. What is the situation on the ground at the moment?
It's very tenuous. I mean, we have blue states, Democrat states, like you've explained, that seem to believe that if you provide these illegal immigrants more government handouts, that they will eventually be a part of the Democrat voter base. And so, what you effectively have is you have the far left here in America that is using the migrant crisis to not only create havoc, but also the thought process that it will funnel more power and more money to the Democrat Party. And then unfortunately, that means they're throwing American families under the bus to do it. I think when you have to think about it, the fact that we're a sovereign nation, our first and foremost concern should be securing our borders and making sure that those who come in are safe and qualified, of course, to be an American citizen. But when you have blue states and Joe Biden running amok, it's not a surprise that you're seeing massive amounts of crime, rioting, looting, fights, and all counts of vulgarity. And the American family is just fed up with what to do.
Yeah, they certainly are, aren't they? And of course, you've got a president, which I think most of the world is looking on and saying, how can you put this guy up for re-election? There's just so many examples of his age showing, when he's giving speeches, he loses his words, he forgets things, he talks to dead people. Um, you know, but putting all of that aside, because I think that is a worry for all of us looking on around the world, who is this guy that is in charge, well, apparently in charge of America? Putting all that aside, all of the policies that Biden has been pushing are disastrous. And I think that is becoming apparent to the American people now, whether it's on immigration, the economy, and all the other policies which they're pushing, whether it's, gender ideology and all of this. Do you think that the Democrats dare put Joe Biden up for election this year? I know they're saying they're going to, but of course they have got this option, haven't they, in August at the National Convention?
I think it's great fun to think about all these political scenarios, hypothetical situations in which one side or the other could do something crazy, right, to try to upend the system. But I think Democrats are wed to Joe Biden. I mean, they've been in charge. Joe Biden hasn't really been in charge for the last 4 years. It's really been his staff and other puppet masters that were really behind the scenes having this work. And so they're going to push Joe Biden once again, but I do see a massive disconnect where they refuse to acknowledge that their policies are creating disastrous consequences for Americans, and they think that if they can just point the other finger or blame someone else, that Americans won't notice. Americans are noticing simply because they can't, it's harder and harder to make a living. And I wouldn't be surprised if they look at, who is in the Oval Office and their particular policies as to why they're in such a dire situation.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, my thoughts are I think they will change Biden as the candidate. I cannot see how they can, with a straight face, put Biden up this year and suggest that he's going to, run the country for another 4 years, because that's what we're talking about. It's not about him, making it through the election campaign. We're talking about another 4 years after the past 4 years. But anyway, Michael, I think one thing is certain. This year is going to be a lot of fun for us spectators and us looking on and seeing what's happened. Michael Austin, thank you very much for joining me on the Freeman Report.
Thanks for having me, James. Till next time.
Thank you. Thank you.